Welcome to Navigating Change, the education podcast from Tybal Inc. I'm Pete Bright, and I am here once again with Howard Tybal. Howard.
Good afternoon, sir.
Good afternoon to you. 'Tis a fine day to talk about controversial subjects, don't you think?
Yeah, we're going to go right to it, aren't we?
Before we dig in, head over to tybalinc.com to learn more about our work in education. Subscribe to the show for free. Just click on that blue button, and we will let you know every time a new episode is released. Of course, you can find Howard. You may want to find Howard after this episode at Howard Tybal on Twitter, and I'm sure he's waiting with Twitter in his hand right now.
I will. You know what? You are always a step ahead of me, Pete. Twitter's open.
There you go. All right, here's the conversation.
All right. Who do we have on the show?
Scott Carlson is an award-winning senior writer for the Chronicle of Higher Education, where he has been contributing to our field since 1999 across a range of issues: college management and finance, the cost and value of higher education, planning, sustainability, so much more. So far, whenever we have mentioned that Scott was going to join us on the show, we have heard an immediate and resounding, "Oh, he's great." Today, Scott joins us to talk about his recent feature, "Should Everyone Go to College?" published in the Chronicle on May 1st, which has sparked some valuable discussion. Link in the show notes if you want to keep up. Scott Carlson, welcome to Navigating Change.
Thanks so much for having me here.
I say it has sparked some valuable discussion. I imagine there are other words we might swap out for discussion.
Yeah, in terms of this topic, and as I have said to Scott and to you, is that when I saw this from the Chronicle, I'm often finding myself, Scott, leading groups around difficult conversations. And, it's one of the reasons why you bring in an outsider is that they can often say the tough thing, or they can raise the tough issue. And this is one of those conversations that everybody sort of rightfully shies away from because it raises tough issues. So I'm curious, first of all, and I know you've got some other pieces, and we're going to actually promote some of those other pieces too that sort of build off of this, and you've got some other work around this I know is coming out. What has been some of the reactions you have been hearing from folks around raising this, should everyone go to college? Do you have anything to share with us about this, or can we not speak about them over the airwaves?
Surprisingly positive, actually. I thought that I was going to get hammered on this one.
Yeah.
And I did get one note from the president of a small college, whom I'd worked with before, who objected to the headline. She didn't like the idea that we were pigeonholing or picking out poor kids as being the ones who should have special consideration for this. Yeah.
Right? Yeah.
And to be fair, the subheading, just to be clear, the subheading is "For poor kids, college for all isn't the mantra it was meant to be." Okay.
But I think that's true. I think that's actually true because I think that rich kids have the cushion, or at least kids of moderate wealth, moderate income, have a bit more of the cushion that enable them to be able to take the risk. I think for low-income students, it's a particularly risky option if they're not prepared. And there's all sorts of, as you were saying, there's all sorts of nuance in this conversation. I'm not in the article, just for people out there who haven't read the article, I'm not saying that low-income kids or poor kids shouldn't go to college. That's not what we're saying. But sort of what I say in the article is, if you're a low-income kid, if you're unprepared for college-level work, you might want to consider other ways to ascend into that world through work, through stackable credentials, through other things.
Well, that gets me right to the conclusion in your article. So you got Anthony Carnival, director of Georgetown University Center on Education and the Workforce, saying, I think, a profound sort of complimentary comment about this idea of whether you're a realist and idealist, right? And an idealist, as you framed it, as he talked about it, is somebody who is looking at this idea of college for all, while the realist is looking at it as let's look at really what's possible. But he raises around this issue of job training in this final comment is that if we're going to go down that road of being a realist, that there are alternatives that would allow you to be successful in the world and not get a 4-year degree. There needs to be a way of packaging this to make it politically acceptable. And I'm curious what you took away from either that comment from him or how you framed it. What do you mean by politically acceptable?
It goes back to this whole discussion of tracking. So tracking in the United States was this institution within the education system that was separating and dividing students, young kids, students in the K-12 system, and sending some, putting some on a college track, and then putting others on sort of a more middle skills track or a sort of a lower skills track. When I was in K-12, it was sort of the last days of auto shop, and I still remember there were a number of students I went to school with who would leave halfway through the day and head down the street to the Votech, or would spend half the day at my high school. They actually still had a place where they were building and repairing cars, so they would spend part of the time there. And there was kind of a sense that, those kids, they're poorer kids, they're kids who are not really on the path that the rest of us are, and that path that the rest of us are could be considered actually a bit of a joke, and I can get into that in a little bit later. But they were sort of thought of kids that were going for something less, right? And I think we still have a hangover from that.
Oh, completely.
From that era. So you look at kids who go to sort of career-oriented programs, and you think, well, that's nice for him, but it's not college, whatever college means.
Oh, and if you talk to parents, I'll tell you this bias against community college, it has that's sort of the modern day version. Because I've also talked to leaders who work in community colleges, and when they talk to their peers who work for private institutions or research, they feel that they're being looked down upon.
That we are doing a disservice to those by not encouraging them so stringently to go to a traditional college.
Yes. And I think, given that the college atmosphere is so tiered, I think it's a bit dishonest, right? Because I'll tell you a story here. This topic has been on my mind for some time. It's been on my mind for about 2 or 3 or 4 years before I actually got around to writing the article. And it came from, some of the thinking behind the article came from a number of comments I'd seen in the Chronicle over time, where we had professors saying, what the problem is in higher education is that we're getting too many kids in higher education who aren't prepared for the work, and they shouldn't be coming to colleges, right? I have a background, having grown up, I studied German culture for a long time and the German language from when I was a little kid. And so I knew a lot about the Gymnasium and Hochschule programs in Germany, where they have this very, much more strict tracking program there. And last spring, I was spending time with a friend of mine from the Netherlands. And he was single in the United States. And so spending a lot of time at bars and talking to people, young people like himself. And he said, he came up to me at one point and he was like, you have all these people that I meet here who say they go to university, but they are as dumb as a box of rocks. They have no idea what's going on. In my country, if you say that you're going to university, that means that you've passed all of these tests. You have, you're considered among the elite from an intellectual point of view. Mm-hmm. And you could say, well, that culture is cutting off opportunities for people. But at some level, he was right about one thing, and that is our perception of what college is. We call all these things college. We call the third tier private institution college. We call the sort of the mid-level state institution college. We call Harvard University college. But they're 3 very different places serving very different sort of capacities for academic study. And that's why I say, we look down on these students who go to auto shop and say, well, there's something else. They're not like us. We're going to college.
Well, the story today, I would say that the commensurate story in our culture is that the BA, getting a Bachelor of Arts, is something that we've been sold that everybody needs to have. And the equivalent elite in this case is if you're going for your doctorate in this culture.
Yeah.
But everybody needs to be, there is no more alternative besides an education for a 4-year degree, and this perception that, and what I can tell you from my kids and their peers, the root among those of us, and again, there's a whole population of adult learners that make up a vast majority of those going to education experience, but most of us who are raising younger kids do not get to experience that college means much more than the 4-year degree. Yeah. However, this view of community college, as I mentioned before, is that this is a way to actually get your feet wet so that you can get into college. Now it's into the 4-year program, and it's all about cost savings. It seems to me that the key question is, and you framed this in the article, is that you said that not all students thrive in academics. Can schools and colleges fairly present and value an array of educational employment pathways while still offering late-blooming learners a chance at a 4-year college and beyond? The challenge is figuring out at crucial junctures who should go which way. It seems to me everybody I would guess, would agree with this idea, and I'm curious what the two of you think of this, that it's not a question of whether you should go to college, but that if you've got the aptitude, if you've got the interest, that the availability of college is there for you.
Yes.
Right? It's not. I mean, what I think is difficult about this conversation, Scott, is it feels it's hard for me. I feel like that I'm being elitist. For me to say that anybody shouldn't be able to go to college, who am I to say that? I'm in no position to judge, and I almost feel like I can't be the one to raise that. And I think that a lot of us who have been invested in higher education find themselves really reluctant to even raise this question because we feel like we are not the ones that can be saying this because we've been afforded the opportunity to go to college. So who am I to say that I can't, that of anybody shouldn't have that access?
But the problem is that in a culture where that cost is increasingly on the backs of individual students themselves, where students who are really unprepared for college, even if they're going to community college, are going to go for a time and then find it to be too difficult and drop out.
Right.
That's not really presenting a real choice or a good choice for those students.
Well, and we are systemically cultivating a culture of shame on the backs of those students too. Students who are not ready to be in the classroom, who can't afford to be in the classroom, who aren't finding the right fit in a 4-year college classroom, but feel because of this societal expectation that there is no hope for them if they don't get through to the other side of this thing. And that, I think, gets to the nut of what of the change that I would love to see. And I'm coming at this as somebody who is in the classroom, right? I am teaching these people who are really struggling with the systems in place and the shame that they carry as a result of the struggles that they are facing.
And by the way, Pete, that's not just people that come from lower socioeconomic status.
Exactly.
Right?
That is...
I know kids that that in my life that are children of peers of mine who struggle with this idea that if I can't step up into this, I am truly being left behind. And for many of them, it's not that they don't have the ability or the access, their parents can afford it. It's that they don't feel like there's a really good alternative. And even community college is treated like it's a second-class prize.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I mean, so when I was talking about my friend from the Netherlands, I mean, many of the students he was meeting at these bars were students who were going to decent public colleges and who came from or private colleges and came from relative amounts of money. I mean, I think what's knocking these kids off the college path often when they're coming from low-income backgrounds is sometimes preparation. I mean, they're going to high schools that are
right.
that just don't have the resources, so they're not getting the kinds of backgrounds in chemistry, pre-calc, trigonometry, and so on, things that they'll need to step into challenging majors in college. That's one thing. The other thing that's knocking them off the path, and this has been part of the series that we've been doing on inequality in higher education, are all the other costs not directly associated with college. It's gas, food, rent, childcare.
Right.
All these other things. That often is what is knocking these kids off the path in college.
So in your research, where are you finding some hopes or a sense that there are either institutions or individuals who are having the conversation in the right way? Because it feels a bit like the nature of this conversation, as you dig into it, it becomes even more tragic than it is on the surface. Like the more we look at it, the more we realize that there isn't a pathway through this conversation. There's more questions to ask before we understand how we're going to get through it. Are you seeing some glimmers of hope where people are having the right conversations to move this in a direction that creates the sense that there's more options than fewer? Yes,
I think we're seeing that more and more these days. So I think, and this I'm pulling a little bit from memory, but in Virginia, the state government of Virginia had made moves recently to make high school more of a direct path into career. So they wanted to give students there the kinds of skills they might need, if they wanted them, to head directly from high school into some sort of money-producing job. The state of Washington, from what I've seen, has been doing a lot of work on this, particularly the state workforce board that's there, which works with labor unions, employers, and state education agencies. I was in Washington not too long ago, and I visited a high school in Toppenish, Washington, which is on the Yakima Indian Reservation in the Yakima Valley. And this high school has adopted career and technical education, which is sort of the newfangled term for vocational education. They've adopted career and technical education as a sort of pillar of what they are offering the students at this particular high school, which is 85% Latino. And you go around this high school and you talk to the students there, and many of them will tell you, yeah, my parents never got out of 6th grade. They migrated here when they were younger. They spend their days either working in construction, or they work in the hop fields in the Yakima Valley, or they pick fruit. And the students, the hope is that the students will aspire for something greater. What the high school has found is that when they started offering career and technical education, it had a way of stimulating the interests of the students to go on to college, to go for something else, and it prepared them better for college. The kids who were in CTE courses performed better on the STEM tests in high school than the non-CTE students did. So now all the students at the high school have to take at least 2 CTE courses before they graduate. The effect of this has been, I talked to this student named Omar Palomino. His father had come from Mexico. Both his father and mother had come from Mexico. They had bit by bit built this business, taking junked cars and fixing them up. They basically had a junkyard, a boneyard for old cars. And he was heading into 9th grade, and he thought, I'm not going to go to college, because in my culture, in Latino culture, your parents need you to work. You need to sort of be there for the family. And he said, maybe I'll get through high school. I don't know if I will, but I really just want to go to work for my family. And he started taking CTE courses as the high school assigned. And he got into a robotics course, and he found that he had sort of an aptitude for building these robots and making them run, and for programming them. He eventually took something like 50th he scored somewhere in the top 50 in robot programming at a contest that had more than 15,000 students at it. He was approached by UW Seattle. He was flown to Washington, D.C. to talk about his experience in CTE courses. And now this kid who didn't want to go to college, wasn't even sure he was going to graduate from high school, is going to be going to Washington State University at Pullman for mechanical engineering to get into a program to learn how to design automotive.
So I mean, that's an amazing story. But what does that tell you? So when you think about that, what does that lead you to think that we need to be thinking more about?
If you want, we're talking about this at the college level, but I don't necessarily know that the problem is at the college level. I think it might be at the K-12 level. And what's happening at the K-12 level is what they liked about the CTE programs at Toppenish was that it got kids out of this sort of pointless consume and then regurgitate form of education, this sort of testing-oriented education. It got them into this thing where they had to think about projects that had open-ended solutions and made them think creatively about what the end products would be, or how they would get to the solution there. That's really more how life is. And yet we're in a K-12 education system that is all about drill and kill. It's all about, let's just test the crap out of these kids all the time, make them regurgitate facts that they're really going to, at one level, they're not really going to use at some level. And then at another level, they don't really understand the purpose of that. I mean, a lot of these students are like, I don't get it. Why am I doing this?
Sure.
This is
Well, what's interesting about this is that when you talk to higher ed people about what you just described, we want kids to come in more prepared, that we flip the classroom. And I work with lots of schools who are having these conversations. At the higher ed level, they're saying, and this is where the tension is, we have this method for evaluating whether a student can cut it here, and the metric they use is basically the SAT and the GPA or the ACTs. So it's one of these catch-22s is that the K through 12 is looking for the higher ed community to sort of reinvent how they're going to measure success. And the higher ed community on some level is waiting for the K through 12 to sort of reinvent preparing the new kids. And they're not coming together and having these conversations at the table. And in the absence of this, it's going to be very hard to create a sustainable, larger available opportunity for more people if the way we measure success in both those domains don't shift and figure out together how we're gonna reinvent that.
That's true. However, I think that at some level we may be measuring the wrong things. So I think success in college has to do less with the tests, although I think the tests can be a good indicator, and I mean there's history behind that, and there's data behind that. But I think success in college has more to do with your resources while you're in college. I can look at my own example for this. You would say that I'm a fairly successful person at what I'm doing. And fortunately, I, at some early point, found out that I wanted to be a writer. And I wanted to think about these ideas and, explore them in essays. I was a terrible, terrible high school student. Terrible high school student. So bad, in fact, that I didn't get into college my first time around. But what I had was resources. My parents are well off. I had the space to fail and to recover from that failure.
Yep.
And in my journey through college, I had the space to be able to explore and to be able to take risks and engage in learning opportunities that would cultivate me into a person who would become successful. The problem is that those opportunities, even the opportunity to get into college on a second or third try, are sort of diminishing. The window of success, the road to success, and the problems associated with failure, or the sort of the pitfalls associated with failure, are, I think, much more dangerous now than they used to be. Tony Carnevale and I talked about this about a year ago when I did a story about failure in higher education. And I talked to a student who came from a wealthy background who failed out of the College of Worcester, and I talked to a student from Baltimore City Community College who came from nothing and who not because of his grades but because of other problems in his life was failing out of college. So the kid from Baltimore City Community College had a much more difficult road.
Well, it's interesting because that came to mind for you when I was raising this issue of how we measure success, and what you digress to, which I think is it's an interesting comment, because to me that has more to do with when we reflect back on how do we get through it. I think that you're absolutely right. I had a safety net. I had a mechanism where I could fail multiple times and I could still be successful. And the truth is, this is what I'm espousing to adults, and I think we say to our kids, is that the way you're going to learn is by failing, and then learning how to regroup or rebound. And your point is, it is getting increasingly difficult for younger people partly because of the increasing cost to go in and fail. And those of us who have greater resources available to it, whether it's support, whether it's family, whether it's money, those are the bigger determinants. The institutions themselves are having conversations, especially the larger ones, around retention as such an important measure for them to get a handle on so they can continue to be viable financially. And the retention issue is challenging because they've got a pool of faculty. There are camps of faculty that say, admit them if they have the skills, and don't admit them if they don't. And you have administrators saying, we can't limit, because of financial issues, we can't limit the number of students we have. We don't want to. So therefore, we need you as faculty to do a better job of helping with the remedial education. Mm-hmm. And this is the institutional perspective about how to get them through. You're speaking on a much more personal basis, and I think it's a key factor that I see this as a core dilemma, because I'm not sure how you get around what you just raised. How do you make, well, you have to find a way to make resources more available, and I think on some level you're talking about financial resources, but not entirely.
Yeah, no. I would also say making more appeals to the intrinsic talents and interests of students. So another thing that might get, and I want to return to your retention issue there in a moment, but when I think about the issue of trying to cultivate talent and interest among students, I think about a speech that I saw at one of these higher education conferences some years ago, where I saw where they had a management guru, come and talk as sort of the opening plenary speaker, and he was supposed to be sort of this inspiring person, and it was, he'd written a book like The 7 Biggest Mistakes Managers Make, or whatever it was. But there was a part of his talk that I thought was pretty interesting, and that was, he said the biggest mistake that managers make when they're managing people is they have sort of a roster of people who work for them, and they've got, say, Bob here, who's a great talker, loves to sell products, loves to get out there and talk to people, but he's not really good with the numbers. Like he never gets his budgets in on time. He can never quite hit the numbers, but he's great. His interpersonal relationships are great. You've got Mary, who's a wonderful creative thinker, but she kind of sticks to herself. She doesn't really get out there. And you've got Rick, he's great with the numbers. And he can talk to people some, but he's not terribly creative. He's kind of a bean counter. And he said the problem with management is that management looks at these three people, and they say they all have to fit this sort of ideal for an employee, right? They all have to be good at all these three things that we just mentioned,
Right.
And he said what we should be doing as managers is we should be looking at our roster of employees and saying, okay, Bob's good at talking to people. Let Bob go out and talk to all the people he wants to talk to. Generate business for us, and don't make him worry about the numbers. We'll have Rick take care of that. And in terms of coming up with ideas, we won't let Rick have to worry about that, because we've got other employees over here who can do that, Mary or whatever. And the problem is that education doesn't do that. Particularly K-12 education doesn't do that. They don't pick out students and they say, wow, for the most part, they don't pick out students and say, wow, this kid over here, he's really physical. He loves, he's really into sort of his body, and he loves sports, but he's not great at math, and he's sort of passable at English. We've got this kid over here who's like a total science nerd, but he doesn't have a creative bone in his body, But they all sort of have to meet these standards that are set. And why don't we spend more time trying to home in, because this is what they're going to do in college anyway, home in on what they're really good at, and really pump those up, enhance those, and prepare them for launching in the world using those skills, those interests.
Yeah.
The retention side of it, I mean, I understand the financial issues associated with retention. If a college can't keep its students, it does end up having financial problems. It doesn't look good for rankings and so on. But at some level, I feel like the retention question is more a problem that the colleges have from a reputation standpoint. It doesn't really have to do with the success of the student. At some level it does, because if they leave and they leave with debt and they don't come back, that's a bad thing. But, I knew a number of students when I was in college, and I was one of these students. My wife was one of these students. It took us, 8-9 years to graduate from a 4-year institution, because we were constantly leaving to go do internships, constantly leaving to go work jobs so that we could continue to go to school and graduate without debt. I think we have to ask the question about retention, about those measurements. Who is that serving?
What's really important, and schools are slowly getting around to this, is that they need to have better data to represent the different kinds of retention issues.
Yeah.
And it's a tracking issue. It's not just tracking them when they're there, but figuring out what happened when they left. Schools don't do typically a good job of understanding why a kid either dropped out or chose to go to a different place. They know why they came in. So this lack of data causes us to have to put sort of a cookie cutter, one overarching view on this question of retention, because I know from working with some faculty that there are stories out there, and faculty would absolutely say, who are committed to their students, that the retention issue for them the central issue there is about student success. And we frame the conversation around this retention piece because there's something to be said for losing 50% of your kids or 62% of your kids after the first year. And as whether we like it or not, this is an industry and this is a business, and you can't run a business if 50% of what it is that generates your revenue leaves every year, while the cost of it continues to rise.
Yeah.
But it requires understanding the data behind the scenes, and many schools don't have that. So what's interesting for me about this is that this whole conversation is that, as I was anticipating getting into it, I was wondering if we're ever going to get to a point in this call or in this talk where we said, you know what, we figured it out. It feels a little bit like we are opening a difficult conversation as a means to get people to minimally talk about this. This is like, again, this is not at all a fair comparison, but when I think about the race conversations, that to me is not about necessarily solving it, but getting people who have different perspectives, different backgrounds and history, to learn how to listen to each other. Because I think this is the missing piece in this dialogue too, is that faculty have a whole spectrum view on this, and instead of engaging them, we try to bring it down to sound bites. Administrators, presidents, and we're living in it's such a decentralized industry, higher ed, that the challenge here is, I think, finding the institutions that are in different sectors within the industry and saying, all right, what are you guys doing well? I love your comment, Scott, that we have to look into K-12. We can't pretend that this is just a higher education issue. It starts with how are we preparing these kids so that they can make those choices to enter. But I think it starts with having a dialogue.
Yeah, and on the retention issue, if students are going to college and they're failing out and then failing out with debt, clearly that's a problem. But there should be these other pathways. There should be a whole range of pathways that students can take that are valid.
It's one of those things, it's a market thing too. I mean, there are 2 points here. Number one is, and to your point, Howard, about how we're minimizing so many of these perspectives. As a faculty member, we often get just sort of lumped into this, faculty are complaining because students aren't prepared again. And that's not really it. If you really sit down with a faculty member and say, why is it upsetting to you that a portion of your students appear not to be prepared? It's because I'm not able to teach why I am here to teach the majority of my students, because I'm having to teach things that I expected they already knew. It's not that I don't want them to be successful. It's that I don't have the time, because of the structure that we've set up, to actually teach all these things. And so we've got to think about that. Think about what is the faculty need in the classroom to actually meet the demands of these students and make sure they're prepared if they want to be there. Right. But the second is that this becomes sort of a market opportunity discussion, right? Isn't there a horizon out there where these schools who are really, sort of part and parcel to the hierarchies of education can say, you know what, we actually think that there's room for to speak in an extreme, a Harvard of Votech. We should be able to cater to students and give them the best mechanic, education, or the best HVAC education that we possibly can, and serve these people so that the colleges, I'm trying to think in terms of the people who are listening to this, is there a market opportunity out here to rethink how we address what is clearly an opportunity for people who might not be ripe for a traditional four-year education? There might be
colleges that offer more than just that are traditionally offering four-year degrees, and that's all they offer. But then you might see more colleges in that space that are offering more kinds of certifications.
Yes,
more
alternative pathways to success.
Yeah. Yeah.
So Scott, as we move towards wrapping up this first of what I hope will be other conversations with you, what I'd love to hear from you is what was your hope, or what continues to be your hope, in raising these and maybe even some future articles you're going to write around these elephant in the room or difficult conversations, especially this one about it's deeper than affordability. It's a deeper question about how we think about what it means to become adults in the world, or have what we need to be to feel good about ourselves in the world, no matter what age we are. What is your hope in writing these things?
In terms of my hope, I think I have an editor who says, you have a recurring theme in your work, and that is the recurring theme, no matter if I'm writing about inequality or some of the other things I've written about in the past, the recurring theme is we've lost our way. And that's the issue I keep getting back to. And I think as it applies to this series of articles, I think we as a society have lost our way, and we're asking higher education to fix these problems that don't really reside in higher education. Tony Carnevale said to me when I was talking about this issue of College for All, he said, if you ask educators how to fix the problem, how to fix problems, the solution they will always offer is more education. But I think as a society, we've kind of looked at successful people in our society, and we've seen that those successful people have a lot of education. But I think we've ignored the fact that the reason that they have a lot of education is because they had the means to acquire that education. They had the kind of preparation that we were talking about. They had the money. They had the resources to launch themselves. And I think that's something that's sort of the big question we're going to have to grapple with eventually. And I think at some point we're going to have to realize that education in and of itself is not really the solution. It's definitely something we need. Fixing this sort of problem we have in our society with civil discussions and civic engagement and these sort of softer skills, a love for the arts, a love for culture. I'm not convinced that college is entirely the answer to our problems with income inequality, unemployment, and stagnant wealth.
Yeah, that very much it very much reeks of sort of 1960s kind of post GI Bill College for All thinking that hasn't been tested effectively.
Yeah, I love that you're sharing that, because I think that you're raising something that could easily get lost in the weeds. Is that we go to what's most obvious and what most of us superficially think is the answer, and I think you're asking deeper questions. And the question is, who do we put together? How do we get a national conversation? Or even at an institution level, how do you get institution leaders to be talking about this more broadly? So I think that's what you're opening up, and that's what so drew me to this conversation versus the typical, here are some financial aid strategies, or all the typical things we're looking that are right in front of us, but really don't address the underlying issues. So I just want to say I really appreciate that you're willing to put this out there and keep going.
Thanks, Howard.
This has been a great conversation, Scott. Thank you so much for your time. Where would you like people to find out more about you? Obviously the Chronicle, but where else? Is that it? Do you want everybody to friend you on Facebook? Yeah.
No. I'm actually very private on Facebook. I do have a Twitter account, but I'm completely inactive. I don't know. I just hope. You know what I hope is let's have that conversation. Let's get together at one of these higher education conferences, whether it's AGB or NACUBO if they'll do it, and have a broad conversation. Invite a bunch of people in the room. Man,
I might even see if I can find a way to promote that. Will you be at the annual meeting this August or this July in Montreal? Out of curiosity, you will if you're invited, right? Is that the answer?
I have to look at my summer schedule, but
okay.
Yeah, if I could swing it, I would do it.
Okay, cool.
This is it's a call to action. Should be a good conversation. Good meeting. Thank you so much again, Scott Carlson. We sure appreciate your time and attention today.
Thank you so much.
On behalf of Scott and Howard Teibel, I'm Pete Wright, and thank you everybody for downloading. We'll catch you next time right here on Navigating Change, the education podcast from Teibel Inc.